Greetings, fellow human. Welcome back to Inside Awala, where I take you behind the scenes of this internet censorship circumvention technology. If you're part of a diaspora community affected by repressive regimes or wars back home, this show is for you. For those just joining us, I'm Gus Narea. I created Awala whilst at Oxford, originally to help people stay connected during internet blackouts by making apps work offline. I went on to establish Relay Corp to shepherd the project forward. This episode covers my attempts to test Awala in the real world and my perhaps surprising decision to chart a new route through China. We'll span from December 2023 to December 2024, a period marked by challenges, setbacks, and a radical shift in strategy. Attempting to test Awala in the real world. Think of building a new technology like Awala as establishing a colony on a new planet. For the past 4 years, we'd been focused on building all the infrastructure, the life support systems, transport networks, and basic facilities needed to make the planet habitable. Now came the challenging part, convincing the first settlers to actually move there and working with them to figure out what we need to improve to gradually bring more people to the planet. For those who listened to our previous episode, you'll recall this colonization analogy. We talked about how we built the foundational infrastructure of planet Awala. Now we're at the crucial next step, bringing in the first inhabitants. But how do you convince people to move to a new planet when they can't be certain it's habitable? That was exactly the challenge I faced at the end of 2023. I had just spent 4 years building Awala, and now I needed to put it in the hands of people who need it. My initial strategy was to test it in regions that were disconnected from the internet due to geographic or economic reasons rather than repression. This would allow me to be physically present during testing, which wouldn't be safe in regions under repressive regimes. I had always envisioned being physically present during these early tests. I wanted to see firsthand how people interacted with the technology, pick up on subtle clues about their expectations and reactions, and fix any issues on the spot. Having an intermediary collect and communicate this information would risk losing crucial details in translation. Remote settlements in the Amazon and Mexico were my primary targets. These regions seemed perfect. People lacked connectivity, but weren't under a government that would block the technology. With the appropriate safety precautions and local partners, I would have been able to fly there and work directly with users. Unfortunately, this plan fell apart, primarily due to funding challenges. Most funding in this space focuses on internet freedom and censorship circumvention, not on connecting the unconnected. I reached out to several organizations working in these regions, but they also struggled with funding. Even if I could cover my own travel expenses, we'd still need funding for their end of the partnership. Additionally, Starlink's increasing availability in these regions, whilst wonderful for those communities, made the testing less beneficial for them. From the start, I knew satellite internet services like Starlink would eventually connect remote regions cut off by geography, economics, or disasters. But there's a catch. These services need government licenses to operate. In regions where governments deliberately cut internet access, those licenses will never be granted. This is exactly where Awala fits in. My plan was to test Awala whilst helping these disconnected communities until proper internet infrastructure became available. Now, I had no option but to pivot to testing Awala in regions subject to internet blackouts due to censorship. Whilst this was always meant to be Awala's main use case, I wanted to avoid these conditions for the initial testing. I couldn't be physically present in these regions for safety reasons. I would need to rely heavily on partners on the ground, and even though I applied for a security audit in September 2023, the first part of the audit was only just completed in October 2024, which made me extremely cautious about any real-world testing until very recently. conflict zones would introduce even more challenges, so I decided not to tackle them during the testing phase and instead focus on government-sponsored internet blackouts. Above all else, securing funding has proven to be the most difficult challenge. As those of you who've been following the podcast will remember, in my experience, funding requests typically take 5 to 11 months, and you must be incredibly specific about how you'll spend the money. Even the quickest funding vehicle, meant for emergencies only, takes about a month to process successful requests. This timing poses a major challenge since blackouts are highly unpredictable. Whilst the average one lasted about a week between 2022 and 2023, some stretched for weeks, months, or even years. Like trying to predict stock prices, you can analyze past patterns and current events, but any prediction about whether a region will still be disconnected a month from now is going to be inaccurate. To make these timescales work, I would need to request a blank check, enabling me to go after any region where a blackout was very likely or ongoing at a moment's notice at my sole discretion, obviously within certain constraints. But I wasn't going to get that. Based on my own experience, this degree of flexibility would make the funding request automatically invalid. Given the challenges with framing the testing initiative in such a way that would make it eligible for funding, and to a lesser extent the fact that I didn't want to run tests in this kind of delicate environment until the security audit was completed, I decided to submit funding requests to several organizations throughout 2024. The main goal was enhancing the technology, like making it more resilient to cyber attacks and adding desktop and iOS support with a smaller budget for maintenance. To be clear, this work, especially the cybersecurity work, is needed regardless of the outcome of the testing. Crucially, this kind of project would enable me to test Awala too, as I would have had a team of people working with me full-time, and I could use the maintenance budget to divert resources to support the testing when needed at a moment's notice. To make that plan work, I would have to work with a partner on the ground that already has, or can quickly get, the resources to make the testing happen on their end, which was possible, but ruled out most of my prospective partners. By June 2024, I had split my time between two main activities. The first was requesting funding from several organizations, which consumed significant time and energy, especially as I watched internet blackouts continue globally. The second was researching and designing crucial but experimental enhancements that were not eligible for funding yet. This included protection against nation-state cybersecurity attacks documented at DDoS.report and Despacito.bot, as well as a mechanism for Awala apps to bypass censorship when the internet is available. I did this so I could have a pipeline of major enhancements ready to seek funding once Awala proved itself with real users. Unfortunately, all funding requests were rejected. Generally, funders wanted the testing itself to be the primary focus of the funding, which makes sense given their own constraints and priorities. However, the processing times and the rigidity of the scope pose significant challenges for me. Some funders were actually happy with the scope, but they wanted to see Awala already working with real users. Other funders didn't even reply to acknowledge the request. This situation reminds me of what many students go through, earning a scholarship and excelling throughout university, only to face the classic catch-22 when job hunting, constantly hearing, "We need someone with experience," but how can anyone gain experience without that first opportunity? Similarly, I had been fortunate enough to get $750,000 to build Awala, delivering on every milestone along the way. Yet now I'm struggling to get it in the hands of those who need it. The pivotal moment came at the start of the summer. I was having dinner with a testing partner when I received the last rejection email. it was clear that I had to change tack. Targeting diaspora communities, starting with the Chinese diaspora. After receiving that last rejection email, I knew something had to change radically. It wasn't just another setback, it was the breaking point. I had gone months without income whilst maintaining expensive infrastructure and working in isolation. I decided that, to gain adoption, I had to make Awala useful before a potential internet blackout. If people only installed Awala when a blackout seems likely, we'd face significant challenges. Regions at risk of blackouts are typically going through difficult times, with people rightfully focused on securing basic necessities rather than downloading apps. On the other hand, if the blackout was ongoing, it'd be extremely difficult to onboard people without partners on the ground. By contrast, if Awala offered a built-in VPN service, people would have a strong incentive to install Awala before the internet is cut off, and it'd be much easier to help them. For example, Awala may not work on a phone we didn't manage to test. As far as I can tell, this effectively means that Awala would become the first technology to circumvent the full spectrum of internet censorship, from app and website level blocking to complete internet blackouts. This is actually a good thing because every single region susceptible to government-sponsored blackouts is also subject to censorship when the internet is available, so people there wouldn't need to install multiple apps. Additionally, this approach would enable us to reach diaspora communities who could then introduce Awala to friends and family back home rather than relying 100% on partners. This would require minimal time commitment from individuals and no external funding would be needed on their part. Without trusted voices promoting it, whether partners or diaspora members, people would never discover Awala. Earlier this year, we had an opportunity to test this diaspora-focused approach when we identified a high-risk region where a blackout seemed likely. However, I ultimately aborted the plan. Without Awala offering any immediate value, asking diaspora members to convince their friends and family back home to install it, just in case, felt wrong. We would essentially be exploiting their fears about a hypothetical blackout that might never happen. Indeed, no blackout occurred in that case. This experience crystallized my thinking. For the diaspora approach to work, Awala needed to deliver value before any blackout. Expanding Awala's scope to also circumvent censorship when the internet is available has always been on the roadmap. In fact, just a few days before the last rejection, I was in Brussels, presenting my plan at SplinterCon. At the time, it was something I intended to do in a few years, so I could remain laser-focused on blackouts. Also, this was only meant to benefit Awala-compatible apps like Letro initially. I decided to start with China. The Great Firewall of China represents the pinnacle of internet censorship technology. By tackling the most sophisticated system first, we could ensure our solution would work everywhere else. This was similar to the strategy I adopted when designing the Awala network, where I modeled the technology after a hypothetical launch in North Korea, as you may recall from the first episode. As I explained then, in the world of censorship circumvention, it's short-sighted to design a system that wouldn't work in the most challenging environment from the get-go, because repressive regimes borrow ideas that worked elsewhere. Targeting China also meant I had to charge for the VPN service. Nearly all VPNs that work in China are paid services due to high operating costs, but we could still offer free tiers in countries with simpler firewalls. Any service that offers a free tier becomes vulnerable to having sophisticated repressive governments like China simply download the app and enumerate all the servers that people are using to circumvent censorship with minimal costs to the government. They can then block these servers, which is exactly what happens to Tor and other free services. Charging for this service also means we'd be less reliant on funders. To make this work ethically whilst ensuring sustainability, I conceived a hybrid approach. The Awala app for Android and desktop will remain open source, but the server-side software needed to operate the VPN service will require commercial licenses for commercial use. So technical people could deploy their own instances of the server for personal use. Protecting the technology from freeloaders is very important to me. Every single commercial VPN provider takes from the open source community, but hardly ever contributes anything back to key projects like OpenVPN or WireGuard, and I'm not going to let that happen here. In fact, I do intend to sell this technology to commercial VPN services with better economies of scale to make the service more affordable to users. What's in it for VPN providers? They could offload the R&D around censorship circumvention to us at a fraction of the cost of doing it themselves, whilst expanding to new markets where their existing solutions don't work. The Awala VPN will be unique not just in its technical capabilities, but also by being radically transparent about its censorship circumvention technology. I already made the technical details of the VPN available to the public, and I will continue to build the technology in the open. To the best of my knowledge, no other commercial VPN provider does this. Some do publish their desktop and mobile apps as open source, but the documentation of their circumvention protocol is vague at best, and their server code is never made available. I made up my mind about the strategy change within 2 days of that rejection email. I took a motorbike trip over a long weekend to sleep on it and look at my plan with fresh eyes upon return. The decision I was wrestling with wasn't just practical, it was ethical. The thought of charging people for a VPN to help them circumvent censorship makes me sick. This isn't the kind of commercial use case I wanted to pursue. The other thing I wanted to consider on my return was the fact that I'm severely resource constrained, and I'd now have to dedicate most of my time to this new project before I even managed to test the Awala network. After the trip confirmed my conviction in the new direction, I started the implementation of a prototype, which I called Fan Qiang, a Chinese phrase meaning jump over the wall in the context of the Great Firewall. Development took approximately 4 weeks, plus a week of testing in China, Iran, and Russia. Designing and building this prototype was breathtakingly quick compared to the original Awala network. I think several factors made this possible. Firstly, the scope was significantly smaller. Whilst the Awala network was built to enable any app to work without the internet, making it incredibly complex, the VPN had a much narrower focus, circumventing sophisticated online censorship. This meant fewer moving parts and a more straightforward technical architecture. Secondly, I could leverage many existing building blocks. With the Awala network, I had to build many components from scratch because nothing like it existed. The VPN, on the other hand, could build upon established networking protocols and tools, even though I still had to innovate significantly to defeat sophisticated censorship. But perhaps the most crucial factor was artificial intelligence, or AI. For the first time, I used AI extensively during development. Even with a relatively basic workflow, using Claude to review and generate code and suggest improvements, I was able to iterate much faster than ever before. The quality of the output was also notably better than I could have achieved by myself. With my plan already in motion, I made one final attempt at external funding this summer. The scope was stripped down to the bare minimum needed to test the Awala network, with a commitment to personally cover the additional costs on my end that are impossible to anticipate, like the fees of the freelancers working for me. This would enable me to respond swiftly to potential blackouts in any region. As part of the proposal, I'd also offer the VPN service free of charge to a limited number of users in the target region, with me also covering those costs personally. I'm currently awaiting the outcome of this request. Building and promoting the Awala VPN. I don't think AI will ever be sophisticated enough to handle product design and marketing autonomously, so I still needed additional human expertise to deliver the Awala VPN. Therefore, I hired a product designer to define our product and marketing strategies, particularly focusing on the Chinese diaspora. We're taking a different approach with the VPN compared to what I did with the Awala network. Rather than building the technology first and doing outreach later, we're starting with outreach. As part of this, we're completely rewriting our long outdated website and launching this podcast, which we expect to be crucial for reaching diaspora communities. AI has been transformative in accelerating our progress. The product designer, with limited coding experience, built our new multilingual website using AI. Even this podcast benefits from AI. When writer's block hit and building a coherent timeline proved challenging, I simply recorded myself rambling for a couple of hours whilst reviewing old emails and funding requests. AI then helped transform those raw thoughts into the structured narrative you're hearing. AI will also be crucial for outreach, enabling us to communicate with people in their native languages. For instance, I can now speak Arabic. يمكنني قول هذا بالعربية. Chinese, 我也可以用中文说. And Russian, я могу сказать это и на русском. I still sound like a foreigner learning those languages, but the accent is clear enough. Alongside the development of the VPN, we're also trying to generate buzz before launch. This outreach work is already showing promising results. Shortly after starting this podcast, someone discovered Awala and shared it on Hacker News, where it reached the front page and received positive feedback. Also, our social media followers and newsletter subscribers have been increasing. The implementation of the Awala VPN has been progressing steadily. I've already received feedback from communities in the field and also requested that the ongoing security audit of the Awala network be extended to include the VPN. My focus is now on the implementation of the VPN on Android. This approach is more transparent and community-oriented than before. We're planning to make some of our building blocks available so that other censorship circumvention projects can benefit from them. The goal is to build more openly and collaboratively, fostering a stronger ecosystem of tools to fight censorship. I believe the funding challenges for Awala's next phase stem from the unique nature of what we're trying to circumvent. The vast majority of censorship circumvention projects focus on enabling access to blocked apps and websites. These use cases are not particularly time-sensitive. Once a government imposes restrictions or tightens them, they rarely loosen their grip. So the need remains constant, even a year later. Internet blackouts are fundamentally different. They're generally short-lived, although again, in extreme cases, they can last for more than a year. Moreover, unlike technologies that operate purely online, the use of Awala involves operating in the real world, and this logistical component is exceptionally difficult to frame in a funding request that must be very specific and detailed, yet takes a long time to process. Unfortunately, these setbacks will significantly delay the wider adoption of the Awala network. We still need to make the crucial improvements mentioned before to be able to scale meaningfully, and the timeline is daunting. By late 2025, I expect to have gathered enough insights from testing to submit a funding request for these essential enhancements, plus anything uncovered by the testing. I'm not attempting another request until I feel I have a good chance of success. Depending on the funder, I'm expecting that request to take between 9 and 12 months, including preparation time. If approved, I'll need another year to build a team and implement the improvements. The prospect that the Awala network may not see meaningful adoption until late 2027 or early 2028 weighs heavily on me. It's a source of profound anxiety and frustration. The commercial potential of the VPN service offers another compelling advantage: self-sufficiency. If successful, It would enable us to independently fund crucial improvements to the Awala network. This autonomy is essential as we enter an era where the censorship landscape is evolving even more rapidly through increased conflict, government investment, and AI adoption. In particular, I fear that AI, coupled with modern hardware, will enable censors to quickly plug the holes exploited by circumvention techniques. I see agility as the key to staying ahead of the curve. The rapidly evolving censorship landscape and its implications for the medium to long term will be the focus of the next episode, the season finale. Rather than offering mere predictions, I'll share my analysis of plausible scenarios and explain how I see Awala adapting to each of them. From mounting geopolitical tensions and growing uncertainty in the free world, to technological advances that could reshape internet freedom. Thank you so much for sticking around until the end of this longer episode. I look forward to catching up with you in 2 weeks for the season finale.